The year is 364 AD. The Roman Empire is a fractured giant, vulnerable and desperate. But then a soldier rises, not from noble lineage, but from the ranks, and unleashes an audacious plan to save it. What forbidden knowledge or brutal tactics allowed Valentinian I to erect impregnable defenses and revitalize a dying army? Uncover the forgotten secrets behind his legendary fortifications and the administrative overhaul that baffled his enemies. Valentinian I, Rome's Last Wall. Rome's Last Wall. This is the story of how an obscure officer was hauled from the margins of empire to the purple. How, once crowned, he stitched a frontier of stone, timber, river, and firelight into a single weapon. How he cut into the diseased flesh of Roman administration with a soldier's severity. How new enemies gathered beyond the woods and steppe, testing every measure he built, and how, in the end, his strength left an emptiness that even his walls could not fill. A winter wind moves over the plains of Pannonia, the middle Danube country where Rome's frontier is not a line but a condition of life. In the market towns and garrison forts, Latin mixes with harsher tongues. Here, empire is measured in pay chests, marching orders, and the constant rumor of what waits beyond the river. It was in this borderland, at Cybele in the early 4th century, that Valentinian was born. Valentinianus, son of Gratian, a soldier who had risen by competence and survived by caution. No ancient house stood behind them, no ancestral masks in marble halls. Their inheritance was the hard discipline of the camp and the knowledge that Rome rewarded endurance when it did not punish it. The Roman world Valentinian entered was no longer the confident empire of Trajan and Hadrian. It was an empire trained to expect crisis, emperors raised and killed by armies, provinces squeezed for revenue, frontiers breached not by single dramatic invasions, but by a persistent grinding pressure of raids, migrations, and opportunistic wars. To be a soldier in such a world was to belong to the one institution that still moved with certainty. Valentinian learned to move with it. His rise was not a straight ascent, but a series of tests in an empire that devoured its own servants. He served under emperors who demanded loyalty and suspected it. He fought in the cold forests and riverlands where Alemannic warbands slipped through gaps in the Rhine defenses, and along the Danube where Sarmatian horsemen could appear as if poured from the grass. He carried the habits of frontier command: swift punishment for negligence, hard rewards for competence, and a relentless attention to the simple mechanics of survival: grain, armor, roads, watch schedules, and the temper of men. Ancient sources remember his physical presence: broad-shouldered, forceful, and impatient with weakness. They also remember a temper that could flare into violence. Yet, in an age when authority often dissolved into intrigue, that raw force had its own kind of clarity. In barracks and on campaign, soldiers understood such a man. He was one of them, and he expected the same from them. Then, abruptly, the empire's center cracked again. In 363, the Emperor Julian died in Persia, leaving an army stranded and desperate. His successor Jovian brought the remnants home, but the damage was done. Confidence in the imperial future was thin as ice. In early 364, Jovian himself died suddenly on the road, leaving the empire headless in a dangerous season. A vacuum yawned open, and in the Roman world, vacuums did not remain empty. At Nicaea, senior officers and officials gathered under the pressure of time. The army needed a name to follow, an emperor to give orders that would be obeyed. The choice was not merely political, it was logistical, military, almost existential. It demanded a man acceptable to the troops, capable enough to hold the frontiers and unentangled, enough not to ignite civil war on the day of his elevation. Valentinian was brought forward. There were other candidates, men with brighter pedigrees or smoother manners. But pedigree did not stop a raid. Manners did not hold a gate. Valentinian's reputation was that of a hard commander who understood the frontier and could enforce discipline. His very ordinariness, his lack of a towering aristocratic network, made him less threatening to competing factions. In an empire exhausted by palace plots, the soldier's logic was brutal and simple: Choose the man who will keep the army together. On February 26, 364, the soldier became Augustus. The moment had the grandeur of ritual, but beneath it lay fear. An emperor could be raised by acclamation. He could also be unmade by the same hands. Valentinian knew it. The empire was too large, its threats too numerous, for one man to command every border in person. Within weeks, he made a decision that would define the shape of Roman power for the next generation. He elevated his brother Valens as co-emperor. It was a practical move and a risky one. Valens was not yet proven, but the empire demanded division of labor. Valentinian would take responsibility for the West, Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain, Africa, while Valens would hold the East. In theory, it was unity. In practice, it was an admission that the Roman world now survived by splitting itself without shattering. From the beginning, Valentinian acted like a man who believed time was his true enemy. He did not seek philosophical glory or marble immortality. He sought usable strength. The frontier was bleeding. The army's standards still flew, but too often above underpaid units, neglected forts, and commanders tempted by bribery. Valentinian's instincts were those of the Danube: mend the fence, harden the gate, punish the thief, and keep the watchfires burning somewhere in the new emperor's mind, shaped by years of marching along riverbanks and through black forests, formed a strategy that few in the glittering imperial cities fully grasped. It was not merely about walls, it was about making the frontier itself into a trap. And so, even as the ceremonial robes settled onto his shoulders, the soldier emperor began to think in terms of timber, stone, river currents, and the speed at which news could travel from a watchtower to a field army. That thinking, born in the mud of the borderlands, would soon become Rome's last great frontier design, and the empire's most carefully constructed illusion of control, drawing the story from the moment of his seizure of power into the unseen architecture of his defenses. Along the Rhine, dawn reveals a line of mist hovering above the water. Beyond it lies the wooded world Rome calls Barbaricum, not a single nation, but a shifting mosaic of peoples, Alemanni, Franks, and smaller groups whose names are known in forts and forgotten in cities. The river looks like a boundary only to those who have never guarded it. To soldiers posted at its edge, it is a road for raiders, smugglers, and warbands, hungry for cattle, captives, and prestige. Valentinian understood that the frontier was not defended by a single wall, but by a system. He inherited earlier Roman lines, Hadrian's stone in Britain, the limes roads and forts of the Rhine and Danube, but the 4th century demanded something more flexible and more aggressive. His response was not to retreat inward, as some later emperors would, but to build outward and deeper at once, knitting the landscape itself into a defense. His fortifications multiplied, refurbished legionary bases, smaller forts and watchtowers that punctuated riverbanks like a string of sentinels. New strongpoints rose at strategic crossings and along roads that could carry an army at speed. Some were little more than compact stone rectangles with stout walls, burghy designed to anchor patrols and guard communication lines. Others were larger, built to hold supplies and shelter troops through a siege. Between them ran the true lifeblood of the system: information. Signals, mounted couriers, and river patrols transformed isolated garrisons into a network. Yet the visible stone was only the surface. The deeper strategy was to deny enemies the comfortable rhythm of raiding. A raiding band thrives on surprise, on the slowness of Roman reaction, on the distance between a breach and the arrival of a field army. Valentinian sought to break that rhythm. He tightened response times, increased patrol activity, and used fortified points to channel movement. Rivers were not just boundaries. They were barriers to be controlled and weapons to be wielded. In some places, Valentinian's forces established positions that threatened the far bank, projecting Roman power beyond the nominal frontier. Whether all such bridgehead works can be securely assigned to his reign is debated, but ancient testimony and archaeological patterns point to an unmistakable policy: intimidation through presence. Even when Rome could not permanently occupy the forests beyond the rivers, it could make those forests feel watched. It could create the sense that any band gathering to raid might be detected early and met not by a militia scrambling from villages, but by trained troops arriving with brutal speed. This was not a gentle vision of border management. It was a landscape disciplined by fear and readiness. When the Alemanni pressed into Gaul, Valentinian responded with campaigns that sought not only victory but demonstration. The emperor's court moved with the army. Imperial authority was no longer only in palaces, it was on muddy roads, beside cold rivers, under the shadow of newly raised stonework. On the Danube, the same principles applied, though the enemy differed, Quadi and Sarmatians, peoples, of the riverlands and steppe margins, whose politics could turn from treaty to raid with a single disputed killing. Here, too, forts were strengthened, patrols hardened, and the emperor's attention was unwavering. The Danube's bends, islands, and marshes became features in an immense defensive design, as if Valentinian were turning geography into an ally. But fortifications, no matter how numerous, were only as good as the men who held them. An emperor could lay stone upon stone. Corruption could hollow it from within, and exhausted soldiers could abandon it at the first hard winter. The deeper question was not whether walls could be built, but whether the Roman state could still sustain the discipline, supply, and moral certainty needed to make those walls mean something. As Valentinian's frontier lines sharpened into a coherent system, he confronted the truth that Rome's danger did not come only from beyond the rivers. It came from within, from administrative decay, from officials who treated provinces as prey, from soldiers demoralized by neglect. The walls required an empire worthy of them. And so the emperor turned from the architecture of stone to the architecture of power, bringing the story into the harsh interior work of reform. In an imperial office, wax tablets lie stacked like silent witnesses. In a provincial courthouse, a petitioner waits with empty hands and a tired face while a clerk decides whether justice will be sold today. In the garrison, a soldier counts his pay and finds it short because someone higher up has found a way to skim the coin. These were not new scenes. They were the ordinary wounds of late Roman life, wounds that could fester into rebellion or surrender. Valentinian approached these problems not as a philosopher king, but as a commander preparing a fortress for siege. He had little patience for rhetorical excuses. If the army was to fight, it would be supplied. If the provinces were to pay, they would be protected. If officials served, they would fear punishment. His military reforms were shaped by necessity. The Roman army of the 4th century was no longer the old legionary machine. It was divided into mobile field forces and frontier garrisons, each with different roles and different vulnerabilities. Valentinian's priority in the West was readiness. He strengthened recruitment, demanded stricter discipline, and enforced standards that could feel merciless to those accustomed to softer command. He promoted competence, often favoring military men who had proven themselves over civilians skilled in flattery. Some contemporaries saw in this a soldier's virtue, others saw the narrowing of power into the hands of men trained to obey and punish. He also understood that the frontier was not merely a military line, but an economic one. Forts required food, weapons, repairs, and reliable transport. Roads, bridges, and depots mattered as much as swords. When an emperor invested in fortifications, he also invested in a supply system, and that meant money. Money meant taxes, and taxes in the late empire could become an instrument of oppression as easily as one of survival. Valentinian's administration sought to tighten control, reduce leakage, and punish theft. Ancient authors record a reign marked by severity toward corrupt officials and by a willingness to use investigators and harsh penalties. There were moments when this could look like justice. There were also moments when it produced terror, when accusation itself became a weapon and fear of punishment pushed men toward desperate acts. Late Roman governance was already a world of surveillance and paperwork. Valentinian did not dismantle that world. He drove it harder, as if more pressure could force honesty from a system built on evasion. For provincial elites, the curiales, the town councilors who carried heavy fiscal burdens, imperial policy could feel like a tightening noose. The state demanded revenue for armies and fortresses, while local economies strained under the weight of obligation. Valentinian's reforms aimed at efficiency, but efficiency in an overstretched empire could resemble ruthlessness. His justice was often real, but it was rarely gentle. And yet, in that harshness, there was a clear intention: to make the Roman state function again, at least in the areas that mattered most for survival. Frontier garrisons were reinforced. Command structures were clarified. Emperors of the later empire often seemed distant, absorbed by court ceremony while provinces bled. Valentinian was not distant. He traveled, inspected, ordered, and punished. He made himself present. Still, even the most forceful emperor could not reform the empire into something it no longer was. Each improvement revealed another weakness. Each wall demanded another tax levy. Each purge of corrupt officials risked creating a new generation of frightened men who cared less for good governance than for self-preservation. The scalpel could cut away rot, but it could also cut living tissue. And while Valentinian reshaped the West with this stern practicality, the world beyond Rome's borders was also changing. The empire's enemies were not static. Confederations formed, ambitions grew, and from farther east, shadows began to lengthen across the steppe. The frontier system was being built not against yesterday's raiders, but against tomorrow's storms. As the emperor tightened his grip on the machinery of war and administration, reports continued to arrive, some of them routine, others ominous, announcing that the pressure on Rome's edges was becoming something more than an ordinary season of raids. The next act of his reign would not be fought in offices or on construction sites, but in the bitter theater of crisis where the walls and reforms would face their first true judgment. In Gaul, the forests were thick and the roads treacherous in winter. Warbands could move fast, strike, and vanish into terrain that seemed designed to swallow pursuit. The Alemanni were not a single army, but a coalition of leaders whose power was measured by raids and victories. To Rome, they were a recurring problem. To themselves, they were a rising force testing an empire that no longer inspired uncomplicated fear. Valentinian met them as a soldier emperor should, with speed, with personal presence, and with a violence meant to deter. Campaign followed campaign along the Rhine. Forts that had been neglected were garrisoned again. Patrols tightened. When opportunity came, Roman forces struck across the river to punish and disrupt. There were victories and there were costs. The emperor's strategy was not to eradicate enemies, a fantasy by this time, but to keep them unstable, uncertain, and wary. But the Rhine was only one front. Britain, far from the imperial court, slipped into crisis in the late 360s. The so-called Great Conspiracy of 367 erupted as multiple threats converged. Picts from the north, Scotti from Ireland, and Saxon raiders along the coasts. Roman units mutinied or collapsed, officials were killed, defenses failed. For an emperor who believed in networks and rapid response, Britain's crisis was a warning flare. The island was not merely distant. It was a test of whether imperial power could still reach the periphery before it was too late. Valentinian responded by sending a skilled commander, Theodosius the Elder, a general of formidable ability. The campaign was swift, methodical, and brutal where it needed to be. Order was restored, forts reoccupied, and administration reassembled. Britain did not become secure forever, but it survived the moment. In the short term, it was a triumph of Valentinian's principle, crisis met by competent force, not by improvisation and excuses. Africa, too, flared there. The rebellion of Firmus in the early 370s exposed the tensions of provincial politics and the brittle relationship between Roman officials and local power. Once again, the empire required decisive military action, and once again it was carried by experienced commanders. The machinery of control still functioned, but only because the emperor drove it, and because a few men of talent remained to execute his will. Meanwhile, in the east, Valens faced his own upheavals, including the usurpation of Procopius in 365 to 366, a reminder that the empire's internal stability was never guaranteed. The Roman world might present a facade of unity, but its imperial structure had become a balance of personalities and loyalties. If a co-emperor faltered, the entire system could shake, and beyond the immediate enemies lurked the beginnings of a far larger transformation. Along the distant horizons of the Eurasian steppe, new powers were stirring, forces that would later push entire peoples westward in waves of desperation. During Valentinian's reign, the most famous of these, Huns, were not yet the direct, overwhelming presence they would become in Roman memory, but the geopolitical air was changing. Movements beyond the frontier could trigger chain reactions, dislodging tribes and creating pressures that no wall could fully absorb. Valentinian's reign therefore became a continuous act of triage. Each year demanded attention: the Rhine, the Danube, Britain, Africa, the loyalty of commanders, the integrity of tax flows, the repair of roads, the rebuilding of forts. Victory was often measured not by conquest, but by the simple fact that Roman administration still functioned in the morning, and that border towns still flew imperial standards at dusk. This constant strain revealed the paradox of Valentinian's achievements. The stronger he made the system, the more it depended on his relentless supervision. The empire did not become self-sustaining. It became more effectively managed by one man's force of will. That was a dangerous kind of strength because it could vanish the moment that will disappeared. In the final years, the Danube frontier demanded the emperor's personal attention again. Tensions with the Quadi escalated, fueled by disputes, broken understandings, and the inevitable friction of a militarized border. Fortifications rose, tempers rose with them. The emperor, older now but no less intense, traveled to the region to impose settlement in the only language he trusted, power. It was there in 375 at Brigetio on the Danube that Valentinian confronted envoys of the Quadi. The meeting should have been diplomacy, an attempt to stabilize a frontier. But diplomacy with an angry emperor could become something else. Ancient accounts describe Valentinian erupting in fury, his temper breaking the fragile boundary between negotiation and wrath. In the midst of that rage, his body failed him. He suffered a stroke and died. The soldier who had made the empire's frontiers feel solid again collapsed in a room of arguments, leaving behind a structure of walls and reforms that now had to endure without the man who had driven every nail into place. His death was not merely the end of a reign, it was the sudden removal of the keystone from an arch still under construction. And in that abrupt silence, the question of legacy rose like mist over the Danube. What exactly had Valentinian saved, and what had his methods set in motion? After his death, the imperial purple passed to his sons, Gratian, already elevated, and the younger Valentinian II, a child thrust into a world of generals and court factions. In the east, Valens continued his own perilous reign. The arrangement Valentinian had created, division of imperial labor, survived him, but it also revealed its weakness. When authority is shared, the empire can be managed. When authority is weak or contested, the empire can fracture faster than a single ruler could ever allow. Valentinian's fortifications remained line after line of stone and timber on rivers and roads. In quiet years, they seemed to prove his genius. Watchtowers still signaled, garrisons still drilled, yet the very permanence of these defenses carried an irony. Walls can hold back a raid. They cannot hold back history. As pressures increased in the decades after his death, the frontier system needed constant maintenance, constant manpower, constant money. Without an emperor who treated the frontier as a personal obsession, the system could become rigid, impressive to look at, but vulnerable to neglect. His administrative severity likewise cut two ways. By punishing corruption and demanding efficiency, Valentinian improved the state's immediate performance. But harshness is not the same as renewal. Heavy fiscal burdens remained, and the machinery of coercion could harden into habit. When survival depends on squeezing more from subjects already strained, resentment grows quietly. Then suddenly, later emperors inherited not only a stronger defensive infrastructure, but also a state more accustomed to forcing compliance than earning loyalty. There were also the personal legacies men raised and relied upon during crisis. Theodosius, the elder, who had served Valentinian with distinction, was later executed under Gratian in circumstances that ancient sources do not fully clarify. The episode hints at the instability Valentinian's death unleashed. Court politics returned, jealousies sharpened, and the careful balance between military command and imperial trust became harder to maintain. Most of all, Valentinian's reign demonstrated that the late Roman Empire could still fight, still build, still administer, if driven with relentless energy. That was his triumph. It is also what makes his legacy haunting. His success suggested that Rome's decline was not inevitable in the sense of immediate helplessness. The empire could be braced, repaired, and made formidable. But it also suggested that the empire's survival increasingly depended on exceptional rulers rather than resilient institutions. When greatness becomes a requirement for mere stability, the future turns into a gamble. In the years that followed, storms gathered more densely than even Valentinian's vigilant system had faced. Movements of peoples accelerated. Borders that had held in one decade could crack in the next. The Western Empire would come to rely on federate arrangements and powerful generals, while emperors became younger, weaker, and more isolated behind ceremony. Valentinian's walls would stand, but the world they guarded would change shape. His reforms would linger, but they would be applied by hands with different intentions and weaker authority. And yet his ghost remains in the narrative of Rome's last centuries. Not as a man who presided over collapse, but as a man who, for a moment, made collapse hesitate. He was a soldier from the frontier who treated the empire like a fortress under siege and acted accordingly, building, drilling, punishing, and commanding with an almost grim piety toward Rome's survival. He did not restore the old world. He bought time for the new one, and time, in the late empire, was the most expensive commodity of all. In the end, The image that lingers is not of a triumphal procession in Rome, but of rivers at dusk, Rhine and Danube, dark bands of water where watchfires flare on distant towers. Those fires, in Valentinian's mind, were never merely signals. They were vows that the frontier would not be abandoned, that the army would not dissolve, that Rome would not simply retreat into memory without a fight. His reign was that vow made visible in stone. And as the centuries turned, and the pressure from beyond the horizons grew heavier, the empire would discover just how difficult it was to keep such fires burning without the man who had ordered them lit.